There is a particular kind of silence that follows a wedding reception when things do not go the way anyone planned. Not the comfortable silence of a night winding down, not the exhausted quiet of family members saying their goodbyes and heading to their cars, but something altogether different, a held-breath silence, the kind that falls over a room like a curtain dropping at the end of a play no one expected to see. That is the silence Claire Montgomery carried with her long after the evening was over, long after the tablecloths were still set, and the champagne glasses sat untouched, and the DJ had quietly packed up his equipment without a single song ever being played for a first dance. That silence, she would later say, was the sound of every lie in the room finally running out of air. And it began with a wedding dress hanging on the back of a bathroom door in an empty hotel room on the 6th floor of a Charlotte hotel. On the last night Claire Montgomery thought she still believed in the life she had built. I walked down that aisle. I smiled at every single person in that room. And I already knew everything. Those are Claire's own words, spoken months after the wedding, in a voice so steady it might unsettle you, because you expect grief, and instead you find something closer to granite. What her mother did should have destroyed her. The woman who raised her, who sat in the front row of every school recital and dried her tears after every heartbreak, who called herself her daughter's best friend and meant it, or at least once had, made a choice the night before that wedding that could not be undone, or explained, or absorbed quietly into the life they had built together. But here is what you need to understand about Claire Montgomery. She did not run. She did not cry. She did not fall apart in a hotel bathroom at midnight and beg the universe for an explanation. Instead, she went back to her room. She lay down on top of the covers, and she started to plan. By the end of this story, you will understand why she did not run. You will understand the particular arithmetic of a woman who spent her entire life absorbing pain quietly and who decided, just once, to let someone else feel the full weight of what they had done. But before we get there, you need to understand what was truly at stake. This was not a simple betrayal. This was not a case of poor judgment or a moment of weakness that could be explained away with enough therapy and enough time. What happened in that hotel room, what Claire saw when she pushed open a door that should have been closed, was the end result of a pattern that had been unfolding for nearly 2 years. A pattern she had been quietly mapping, a pattern she had almost convinced herself she was imagining. She was not imagining a single thing. There are 3 questions that will anchor everything you hear in the next 2 hours. First, how does a woman discover the worst betrayal of her life, the very night before her wedding, and choose to walk toward it rather than away? Second, what does real, considered, controlled revenge look like when it is not loud, not impulsive, not fueled by the kind of rage that burns itself out, but instead built quietly over weeks, with the precision of someone who has been waiting for exactly the right moment? And third, and perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, what does it mean when the person who betrays you most completely is not a stranger or a rival, but the woman who brought you into the world? Claire Montgomery's story does not offer clean or easy answers. What it offers instead is something considerably rarer, something that will stay with you long after this video ends. Claire Montgomery was 38 years old when she got married. She was a senior project manager at a mid-sized architectural firm in Charlotte, North Carolina, a position she had earned not through connections or the right last name, but through 15 years of arriving early, staying late, and outworking people who had twice her resources and half her discipline. She was the kind of woman other women quietly admired, without always being able to articulate why. Not the loudest person in the room, not the most immediately striking, but if you watched her closely, and very few people ever did, because she did not demand attention, you would notice something in the way she moved through a conversation. She processed everything. She filed things away. She had a stillness about her that some people mistook for reserve, and others, if they were more perceptive, recognized as something closer to discipline. Claire Montgomery did not react. She responded. And there is an enormous difference between those two things. She grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina, the only child of Diane and Robert Montgomery. Robert left when Claire was 9 years old. He did not leave dramatically. No shouting, no broken furniture, no scene that a child might reconstruct in memory as a traumatic landmark. He simply was there one week and gone the next. A man who packed a single bag and drove away on a Tuesday morning, while Claire was at school, leaving behind a handwritten note on the kitchen counter that her mother read once and never mentioned again. Claire did not learn until she was 17 that her father had another family in Raleigh, a woman he had been involved with for years. 2 children who were practically the same age as Claire herself. The first lesson her childhood taught her was this: people contain secrets they have absolutely no intention of ever confessing to. She absorbed this lesson thoroughly. She did not know, until many years later, exactly how thoroughly she would need it. After Robert left, it was just the 2 of them, Claire and Diane. And for a very long time, that felt like enough. More than enough, actually. Diane was the kind of mother who made single parenthood look like a deliberate choice, rather than a wound that had never fully healed. She worked 2 jobs through most of Claire's adolescence, a receptionist position during the day and bookkeeping from the kitchen table late into the night, and never once made Claire feel like a burden or a reason for sacrifice. She was present. She came to school plays. She made dinner most nights. She taught Claire to be careful with money and careful with people, because in her hard-earned experience, those 2 things required exactly the same kind of vigilance. Claire adored her in the way of someone who has watched their parents struggle and rise and struggle again, which is a deeper and more lasting kind of love than most people are lucky enough to feel for a parent. What Claire did not have the language for, as a child, or even as a young adult, was the particular edge that lived beneath her mother's warmth. Diane was generous, genuinely so, but she was also competitive in a way that did not always announce itself clearly. She wanted to be the most admired woman in any room she entered. She wanted to be the one people called first, consulted first, noticed first. For most of Claire's childhood, this quality sat quietly in the background, almost invisible, because Diane directed it outward, toward colleagues, neighbors, women in her social circle, whom she assessed with a coolness that Claire once found amusing and later found unsettling. It was only as Claire grew older, as she became accomplished and well-regarded in ways her mother could not take credit for, that something shifted beneath the surface. Something that neither of them ever named directly. Something that, in retrospect, should have functioned as a warning of the highest order. Marcus Holt was 42 years old when he proposed to Claire, and by most visible measures he was exactly what he appeared to be. A commercial real estate developer with a portfolio of mixed-use properties across the Carolinas and Georgia. A man who wore success quietly enough that it did not tip into arrogance. At least not obviously. At least not in any way Claire initially detected. He was 8 years older than her, which she had always found steadying rather than concerning. He had been married once before, briefly, in his early 30s, a fact he disclosed on their 3rd date with a directness she appreciated. The first marriage had not produced children and had not produced bitterness, as far as she could tell. He spoke about his ex-wife without contempt and without nostalgia, which struck her as a sign of emotional maturity. She filed that observation away alongside everything else she noticed about him. That was Claire's way. She filed everything. She simply had not yet learned what she was ultimately filing it for. They met at a charity fundraiser for a children's hospital in uptown Charlotte, the kind of event where the wine is too expensive and the conversation is exhausting, but the cause is real, so you go anyway and hope for the best. Claire was there representing her firm. Marcus was there because he had donated the event space for the auction. They ended up at the same high-top table during cocktail hour, 2 people who both visibly looked like they would rather be somewhere quieter, and by the time dinner was called, they had been talking for over 40 minutes and had missed most of the auction entirely. He called her 3 days later. Not a text, a phone call. She picked up on the second ring and later told her closest friend, Tessa Briggs, who would become her maid of honor, that she had genuinely hoped he would call. They dated for 14 months before he proposed. And the proposal, she would tell people, was the thing that convinced her he was truly different from anyone she had known before. It was a Tuesday morning, and there was no audience, no reservation at a rooftop restaurant, no friends hidden around a corner with cameras, no grand gesture constructed for social media. Marcus had made breakfast. Eggs, the good coffee, the kind of deliberate morning that feels intentional without being staged. And after they had been at the kitchen table talking for a while, he put down his cup and said he had something to ask. He did not get down on one knee. He reached across the table, took her hand in both of his, and said he wanted to spend the rest of his life having Tuesday mornings with her. The ring had been in his jacket pocket the entire time. Claire said yes before he had finished the sentence. She called Diane that afternoon, and Diane cried on the phone for 10 full minutes. Happy tears, she said. Proud tears. The kind a mother sheds when her daughter has finally found exactly the right person. That is what she said. Those are the exact words she used. Diane met Marcus for the first time 6 weeks after the engagement. At a dinner Claire organized with care, a comfortable restaurant she knew her mother would love, a Sunday evening relaxed enough to let the conversation breathe. By all outward appearances, it went beautifully. Diane charmed Marcus the way she charmed everyone, and Marcus responded the way people always responded to Diane, warmly, openly, pulled in by her laugh, and the way she made whoever she was talking to feel like the most interesting person in the room. At some point while Claire was in the restroom, Marcus apparently spent 15 minutes with Diane discussing a real estate development near the neighborhood where she grew up. Claire came back to find them laughing together. She felt grateful. She thought, this is exactly what I hoped for. She told herself that version of the story for a long time, because it was the version she needed to believe. It was not the only version available to her. She simply had not yet received enough information to choose a different one. The first moment something did not sit right, Claire ignored it. This is not a criticism of her judgment. It is simply what people do when discomfort comes into conflict with what they want to believe. It was about 4 months after the engagement, a Sunday afternoon, when Marcus was supposed to be at a site inspection in Raleigh. Claire's phone rang while she was grocery shopping. It was Diane, calling to chat the way she often did on Sunday afternoons. And midway through the conversation, something Diane said, an offhand comment about a specific development project near her neighborhood, a detail she mentioned with slightly too much ease and slightly too much precision, made Claire pause mid-aisle. It was a detail Marcus had mentioned to Claire only once, weeks before, in passing. She could not account for how Diane would know it. She filed it. She kept shopping. She went home and made dinner. That night, she turned the detail over in her mind 3 times before sleep came. She did not forget it. Tessa Briggs had been Claire's closest friend since they were 25, having shared a 2-bedroom apartment in Charlotte's Noda neighborhood at a time when both of them were broke and ambitious and certain the city was about to reveal itself to them properly. It had, eventually, for both of them. Tessa now ran a boutique event planning company that kept her constantly occupied and perpetually behind on sleep. And she was Claire's maid of honor in the unspoken and absolute way of certain long friendships where the question never needs to be formally asked. Tessa was also, and this matters for what comes next, the kind of person who noticed things, not intrusively, not nosily, but with the precise, cataloging attention of someone who had spent years managing events where a single overlooked detail could unravel an entire evening's careful preparation. She noticed things. She sat on them, usually, unless the moment came when sitting on them was no longer something she could justify. In February, that moment came. The rehearsal dinner was held at Hartwell's, a restaurant with a private dining room in the South Park area of Charlotte, on a Friday evening in April, the night before the wedding. 22 people in attendance, immediate family, the wedding party, a handful of Marcus's closest professional contacts, and Claire's oldest friends. The space was warm and candlelit and arranged precisely the way Claire had wanted it. Elegant without coldness, celebratory without excess. She had planned every detail herself over the preceding weeks, down to the floral arrangement on each table and the sequence of the courses. She sat at that dinner with 22 people she knew well, in a room she had designed, and she felt the particular calm of someone who has already made her most important decision and is simply waiting, with complete patience, for the clock to move forward. No one at that table could have identified a single thing that was wrong. That was entirely the point. Marcus gave a toast midway through dinner that made half the room reach for their napkins. He talked about the Tuesday morning he proposed. He talked about the way Claire listened, not just to him, but to everything around her, with an attention he said he had never encountered in another person. He said he had spent his life up to that point in rooms full of people and regularly feeling completely alone, and that from the first evening he met Claire, he had not felt that way once. He raised his glass. He said he could not wait to spend every morning for the rest of his life with her. The room responded with the warmth of people who are genuinely moved. Claire smiled at him from across the table. It was a genuine smile, She would return to that detail in the months that followed, with a complicated emotion she could never quite reduce to a single name. The smile was still genuine. Both things were true simultaneously. Diane sat at the rehearsal dinner in a deep green dress that drew exactly the admiring comments she had dressed to receive. She was gracious and effusive, and at 3 separate points during the evening told 3 different people that she could not have chosen a better man for her daughter herself. She hugged Claire twice during the cocktail hour before dinner. She pulled Marcus aside at one point. Claire watched from across the room, wine in hand, and said something to him with her hand resting on his arm that made him nod slowly and drop his eyes to his shoes. When Claire asked Marcus later in the evening what her mother had said to him, he told her Diane had said she was proud of him, that he was exactly what she had always hoped for Claire. He said it warmly. He seemed genuinely touched. Claire smiled and said she was glad. She had been watching both of them with great care all evening. She noted everything. She said absolutely nothing. The dinner closed at around 10:30. The goodbyes stretched pleasantly, the way they do when people are feeling the collective, slightly sentimental weight of an occasion. Tomorrow is the real thing. The embraces communicated. Tomorrow it is official. Diane found Claire near the coat check as the evening ended, reached up to take her daughter's face in both hands, the way she had done since Claire was a small child, and said, "I am so proud of you. I want you to know that." Claire looked at her mother's face. She considered, in that moment, every single thing she knew. She said, "Thank you, Mom. I love you." And she meant it, in the specific way that a person can mean a thing completely and also be standing in the middle of their own grief about it at the same time. Those two states existing side by side without canceling each other out. They embraced. Claire watched her mother walk to her car. Then she went back inside to collect her jacket and say her remaining goodbyes. It was 11:47 at night when Claire realized she had left her overnight bag in Marcus's hotel room. She remembered it as she was preparing to settle in for the night. A small leather bag she had packed carefully with things she would want on the morning of the wedding, items she did not want to be searching for at 6 in the morning. They had agreed to keep to a version of tradition, separate rooms the night before the ceremony, a request Claire had made months prior, and Marcus had accepted without question. His room was on the 8th floor of the hotel. Hers was on the 6th. She pulled on her coat over her pajamas, picked up her key card, and stepped into the hallway. The hotel had gone quiet the way hotels do after 11. A particular hush that makes your own footsteps sound magnified. She rode the elevator to the 8th floor. She walked the corridor to room 814. She reached for the door handle. The door was not latched. A member of the housekeeping staff had been in earlier in the evening to replace towels and had not pulled it fully closed behind them on the way out. The door was not standing open, but it had not caught in the frame, and it had drifted, in response to the faint air movement from the corridor, just far enough that there was no resistance at all when Claire's hand found the handle. She pushed. She stood in the doorway for 4 seconds. She has since said that she counted them, not intentionally, not because she was composing herself, but in the involuntary way the mind records certain moments with a precision that serves no immediate practical purpose and yet never leaves you. 4 seconds was sufficient to confirm everything she had spent 6 weeks hoping she was wrong about. Every odd comment, every unexplained afternoon, every GPS record she had checked at 2 in the morning, every receipt, every moment her mother had touched Marcus's arm at a dinner table and Claire had filed it away rather than named it. 4 seconds. Then she closed the door. She walked back to the elevator. She pressed the button for the 6th floor. The ride down was completely silent. The hotel music had been turned off for the night. She walked the length of the 6th floor corridor to her own room and let herself in and sat down on the edge of the bed. She did not cry. She has repeated this many times since, and it confuses people who hear the story because they expect that a discovery of that magnitude would break something open immediately, and perhaps for most people it would. But Claire was not most people, and this was not her first lesson in what people you love are capable of concealing. She sat on the edge of the bed. She breathed, deliberately and slowly. She looked at the wedding dress hanging on the back of the bathroom door where she had placed it that evening to let it breathe overnight. She looked at it for a long time. Then she picked up her phone, opened her notes application, and she started to write. What she wrote in that notes app over the next 40 minutes was not an emotional accounting of what she had just seen. It was a record, chronological, dated, factual, of everything she had observed and quietly gathered over the 6 weeks prior. She laid it out so that she could look at the whole of it clearly, in one place, and be absolutely certain she was not missing something. She was not missing anything. She read the full account back to herself twice. Then she set her phone face down on the bedside table. She set an alarm for 6:15 the following morning. She lay down on top of the covers exactly as she was, coat still on, shoes still on, and she closed her eyes. And she slept. Not the heavy sleep of someone in denial, not the fitful sleep of someone in crisis, the deep, even deliberate sleep of a person who has made her most important decision and is conserving everything she has for what the next 16 hours will require of her. Before we go any further into what happened next, I want to take just a moment because this story is not a simple one, and the decisions Claire made in the hours that followed require the full context of who she is and how she arrived at that hotel room on that particular night. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The stories we tell on Tales of Whisper are not only about revenge or resolution, they are about what people do with the things that should have finished them. And Claire Montgomery was not finished. Not even close. Tessa drops the information 8 weeks before. To understand what happened inside that hotel on the night before the wedding, you have to go back 8 weeks. Not to the discovery, but to a Sunday morning brunch at a restaurant in Charlotte's Plaza Midwood neighborhood, a place with good biscuits and bottomless coffee and the low, comfortable hum of weekend conversation all around. Tessa had been quieter than usual for most of the meal, which was sufficiently unusual that Claire had noticed and was waiting, patiently, for whatever was coming. It came over the second cup of coffee. Tessa set her mug down, looked across the table at Claire with the careful expression of someone who has been rehearsing what they are about to say, and told her that 3 weeks prior, she had driven past Diane's house on a Wednesday afternoon on the way to a venue walkthrough. Marcus's car, a gunmetal gray Audi she knew well enough to recognize, had been parked outside. She had driven past a second time to be certain. She was certain. Marcus had told Claire that Wednesday he was in Raleigh for a site inspection. Claire listened to all of it. She did not ask Tessa to repeat anything. She did not cry. She did not show Tessa or anyone else at any adjacent table what that information cost her to receive. She simply nodded once, slowly, and took a sip of her coffee. Tessa watched her face very carefully and said nothing else. She understood, without needing it explained, that Claire was already thinking rather than feeling, and that anything additional she offered in that moment would be noise that got in the way of that thinking. They finished the meal. Claire drove home in complete silence. She made herself a cup of tea when she arrived, and she sat at her kitchen table until 2 in the morning. Not calling anyone, not texting anyone, thinking. She went back through every interaction between Marcus and Diane she could recall. She thought about the comment Diane had made months ago about the development project. She thought about the restaurant receipt on the shared credit card she had half noticed and half explained away. She opened her phone and wrote down Marcus's exact words when she had asked him about that receipt. She wrote them down in a new folder. The Monday after that brunch, Claire made her first deliberate and methodical move. She and Marcus shared a family phone plan, a practical arrangement from early in the relationship that neither of them had had occasion to revisit or reconsider. The plan included a location sharing feature that had been activated the previous autumn when Marcus had driven into a winter storm on his way back from a project in Asheville, and Claire had wanted to be able to monitor his progress on the road. The feature had remained active ever since. Marcus had not disabled it. She was not certain he remembered it was still running. Over the following 2 weeks, working in the evenings after Marcus was asleep, Claire checked the location history and recorded what she found in a private folder within an email account he had no access to. What the record showed was a pattern. 5 separate occasions on which Marcus's verified location placed him in Diane's neighborhood on days when he had given Claire a different account of where he was. 3 of those occasions were during the working day. 2 were in the evening. None of them had been mentioned to Claire. She moved to the credit card statements next. Methodically, the way she would approach a site audit at work. She was looking for the restaurant charge she had half noticed weeks before and partially set aside. She found it. March 14th, a restaurant called Mira's Kitchen in the zip code where Diane lived. A Wednesday evening, The bill was $94, which does not represent a dinner for one person at a restaurant of that type. Marcus had told Claire that Wednesday he was having dinner in town with a developer contact who had flown in from Atlanta. She had not questioned it at the time. She wrote down the date, the total, and the name of the restaurant. She continued through the statements, month by month. She found two other charges she could not account for with confidence. A florist, also in Diane's neighborhood, purchased on a date that did not correspond to any occasion Claire was aware of, and a parking structure charge on a street 1 block from Diane's house on a Saturday afternoon in February, when Marcus had said he was playing golf with Derek. The voicemail came to her attention through a process she had not initially designed as investigation. She and Marcus had set up a shared cloud backup for photographs early in the relationship, one of those small domestic arrangements that feels both practical and romantic, and that neither person thinks about much afterward. She had gone into the shared account to retrieve a set of engagement photographs she needed for the wedding program. While she was in the account, she noticed that audio files, including voicemails from Marcus's device that he had apparently not deleted, were also stored there as part of the backup. She recognized her mother's voice immediately. The message was not explicit. Diane was far too careful for that. What it was measured and deliberate in the particular way of someone who is aware that what they are saying could be heard by someone they did not intend to hear it, and who is choosing their words accordingly. But the shape of what those careful words added up to was unmistakable to anyone listening with full context. Claire exported the file to her personal device. She saved it in a folder she labeled Tax Documents 2023, and she did not play it again until she needed to.
3 weeks before the wedding, Claire made an appointment with a family law attorney 40 minutes outside Charlotte, far enough that she was unlikely to encounter anyone she knew in the waiting room or the parking lot. She paid the consultation fee in cash. The attorney's name was Patricia Elaine Morse, and she had practiced family law for over 2 decades in the state of North Carolina and had seen, she said at the outset of their meeting, most of what the field had to offer in terms of human behavior under pressure. Claire laid out the situation across that desk with the same calm and organized precision she brought to a project file at work. Not emotionally, factually. She told Patricia what she knew and what she had documented and what she was considering. Patricia listened to all of it without a single interruption. Then she asked Claire one question, a question that would reshape the trajectory of everything that followed. She asked whether Claire had yet considered the legal distinction between what a prenuptial agreement could accomplish versus what a postnuptial settlement could accomplish in her specific circumstances. What Patricia explained, in the clear and unsentimental language of someone who has delivered difficult information to people in difficult positions many times before, was this. A prenuptial agreement, had Claire chosen to disclose what she knew and call off the wedding before it took place, would have left her with nothing beyond what she already individually owned going in. The investment property she co-owned with Marcus, a commercial mixed-use building in South End, Charlotte, that had appreciated significantly since its original purchase, and in which her ownership interest was fully documented, would have remained in Marcus's name entirely. She would have had no legal claim to any of that appreciation. A postnuptial agreement, by contrast, executed after the marriage had been legally formalized, even if only briefly, opened substantially different options. The marriage would need to exist as a legal fact before it could be dissolved. But the dissolution, when it came, could happen on terms that accurately reflected what she owned and what she was genuinely owed. Claire sat with this information for a long time. Then she said, "Tell me exactly what I need to do next." Over the 2 weeks that followed the meeting with Patricia, Claire made 2 additional quiet moves. The first was to transfer her personal savings, money she had earned before the relationship began and had maintained in her own accounts throughout, into a solo account that Marcus had no visibility into whatsoever. She simply made it, without announcement, as was entirely within her right to do. The second move was more carefully calibrated. Marcus had a business partner named Gerald Whitfield, a man who had known Marcus for over a decade and who had always treated Claire with a kind of quiet, considered respect that she genuinely valued. She arranged dinner with Gerald under the pretext of reviewing paperwork related to the South End property on which she held co-ownership documentation. During that dinner, she raised, in careful, non-accusatory language, some questions about recent valuations on the property that she felt deserved clarification before any future decisions were made about it. Gerald listened carefully. He said he would look into it. He did look into it.
This would matter later, in ways Marcus would only begin to understand on the night of the wedding. The presentation Claire assembled for the reception was built over the final week before the wedding, late at night, alone. She shared none of it with anyone. Not Tessa, not Patricia, not a single person in her life. She gathered the materials she had collected, the GPS timeline formatted cleanly with dates and verified locations, a selection of the most plainly significant text exchanges recovered from the cloud backup, the restaurant receipts, the parking charge, the voicemail. She arranged them into a sequence that told the complete story without any accompanying commentary or editorializing, a clean, self-evident chronological account that anyone looking at a screen would be able to follow without assistance. She had it formatted and output at a downtown print and design shop, telling them it was a business presentation she needed prepared professionally. She then contacted Renee, the event coordinator at the reception venue, and made a specific and particular request about the AV setup for the evening. She described it as a surprise tribute she was planning for her guests. Renee, who had worked weddings for 11 years, was delighted to accommodate her. Claire woke at 6:15 the morning of the wedding, exactly as she had planned. She showered. She made a cup of coffee from the hotel room machine. Not as good as the coffee she made at home, but adequate, and she stood at the window of her room on the 6th floor and looked out at Charlotte still arriving at itself on a Saturday morning in April. She felt calm in a way that required no effort, which she recognized as the particular feeling of a decision already fully and completely made. Her hair and makeup team arrived at 7:30, and she sat in the chair and let them work, holding the coffee in both hands, responding to messages, reviewing a mental checklist with the same efficient attention she brought to the first morning of any major project at work. Tessa arrived at 8. She came in and looked at Claire's face in the mirror for a long moment. She said quietly, without the lift of a question, "You're sure?" Claire looked back at her in the mirror. She said, "I have never been more sure of anything in my life." It was at that moment, on the morning of the wedding, that Claire told Tessa the shape of what she had assembled. Not every detail, but the essential structure of it. Tessa listened with the complete and focused silence of someone who understood that speaking would only get in the way. When Claire finished, Tessa sat down on the edge of the hotel bed and was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked 2 questions. The first, whether Claire was absolutely certain about what she intended. The second, whether she needed Tessa to be anywhere specific at any specific time during the reception. The answer to both questions was yes. Tessa nodded. She reached across and took Claire's hand and held it firmly once. Then she stood, smoothed her bridesmaid dress, and said they had a wedding to get ready for. She spent the rest of that morning helping Claire into her gown, keeping the other bridesmaids occupied and cheerful, and privately packing an overnight bag for Claire with the precise and thoughtful knowledge of a person who has been someone's closest friend for 13 years. The ceremony was held at a converted estate just outside Charlotte, 12 acres, open sky, the kind of April afternoon that looks as though it was arranged specifically for the occasion. 83 guests, in white draped chairs. The processional began at 3 o'clock. Claire walked alone. She had decided months ago that she did not want to be given away, a decision made for her own reasons in a different context, and that decision now carried a quieter, more specific meaning that she had not anticipated when she first made it. She walked the full length of the aisle at a measured and unhurried pace, and she smiled at every face she passed. She smiled at Marcus's mother in the 3rd row on the right. She smiled at Diane, seated in the front row in the deep green dress, who was pressing a tissue to her eye. She walked to the altar. She took Marcus's hand. She felt the particular strange clarity of someone who is standing in exactly the right place for completely different reasons than anyone watching them understands. At the altar, Marcus looked at her the way he had always looked at her, with an expression that was, whatever else it also was, genuinely tender. This is the part of the story that Claire has said she finds most difficult to speak about accurately, even now. Because the person standing at that altar watching her come toward him was not only the person who had betrayed her, he was also the person who had reached across a kitchen table on a Tuesday morning and said he wanted Tuesday mornings with her for the rest of his life. They were true simultaneously. Claire understood, by the time she reached the altar, that the world rarely delivers its worst betrayals through people who are entirely and straightforwardly monstrous, and that fact makes it considerably more necessary, not less, to respond to those betrayals with precision rather than emotion.
She took his hand. She answered every question the officiant asked in a voice that did not waver once. They signed the marriage license in a small room adjoining the garden. The two of them, the officiant, and their two witnesses, Tessa and Derek, Marcus's best man. Claire's hand was completely steady as she signed. She passed the pen back. Marcus tucked the document under his arm with the relieved expression of a man who has been waiting for something significant to be formalized and is grateful that it finally is. He leaned in and kissed her on the cheek. She tilted her face toward him. She thought, clearly and without any particular emotion, "This document is now real." Patricia Morse had told her, the moment both parties and the officiant sign the license, the marriage exists in law. It requires no reception, no photographs, no first dance, no further ceremony of any kind. The legal fact had been established. The next part of what Claire had planned could now begin. The reception was in the estate ballroom. Tall windows, warm light, terrace doors open to the April evening air. Cocktail hour ran from 4 to 5 o'clock, and by every outward measure, it was a beautiful wedding cocktail hour. A string quartet played somewhere inside near the entrance. Guests moved between the terrace and the bar and the hors d'oeuvre stations, with the pleasant looseness of people for whom a long-anticipated thing has at last been accomplished, and the remainder of the evening exists simply to be enjoyed. Marcus worked the room with his characteristic ease, laughing, remembering names, making each person feel noticed. Diane held court near the French doors with a cluster of Claire's family members, the deep green dress still drawing comments. Claire moved between guests, thanking, introducing, doing precisely what a bride does at her own reception. She was monitoring the time carefully and steadily. At 4:55, she excused herself from a conversation, stepped through a side door into the corridor beyond, and spent 90 seconds with Renee, the event coordinator. Renee confirmed, without elaboration, that everything was prepared exactly as requested. The USB drive had been loaded into the venue's presentation system and tested. The HDMI connection to the main display screen behind the head table had been checked twice and was confirmed operational. The room speakers had been calibrated to the specific volume level Claire had specified. Renee had not asked questions beyond what was necessary to execute the request. She had worked events long enough to understand that the person commissioning a wedding gets their requests honored without editorial input from the staff. She handed Claire a small wireless presentation clicker and walked her through its function in about 20 seconds. Claire thanked her. She slipped the clicker into the inner pocket of her reception clutch. She had selected that clutch weeks ago, specifically because it had an inner pocket, at a time when she was thinking through exactly this detail. She walked back into the ballroom. She smiled at the next guest who caught her eye. She took a sip of water. She waited. At 5:10, guests were called in from cocktail hour and seated for dinner. 83 people at 10 round tables. The seating arrangement had been planned by Claire with her characteristic attention. She had thought carefully about who would enjoy sitting near whom, where the social energy of the room would be warmest, which combinations of people would produce good conversation, rather than polite silence. Diane was placed at the family table nearest the head table, beside Claire's aunt and two cousins from her father's side of the family. Marcus's family sat to the right of the head table. Claire and Marcus sat at center. Tessa sat at the end of the head table closest to Claire's chair. At dinner, Tessa poured Claire's water before her own, passed the bread basket without waiting to be asked, and once rested her hand briefly on Claire's forearm when the first course arrived, a brief, quiet gesture that said everything it needed to say. She did not speak. There was nothing left that needed to be said between them. Dinner ran just over an hour. 3 courses, genuinely good, the kind of wedding food that receives a sincere compliment rather than a diplomatic one. Marcus's best man Derek gave a toast that hit every mark it needed to hit. Tessa gave hers, warm, measured, specific about Claire, without revealing anything Claire had shared with her in private, and ending with a line that made most of the room laugh once and then go quiet, in the way of something true said simply. When Tessa finished, she looked down the table at Claire with the briefest expression that only Claire was in a position to read accurately. The dinner plates were being cleared. The DJ was preparing his equipment. The room had arrived at that particular, celebratory looseness that follows a good meal and an extended open bar. Marcus reached over one final time and covered Claire's hand with his and said it had been a perfect day. She looked at him steadily. She agreed that it had been.
She looked at the time on her phone under the table. She stood up from her chair. She walked to the microphone. The DJ had been told in advance that Claire would make an announcement before the first dance, as she had arranged weeks prior. She walked to the microphone stand and lifted it from the clip, and she walked to the center of the ballroom floor in front of the head table. The room quieted the way rooms do when a bride takes the floor in the middle of her own reception. A few people reached for their phones to film. Most simply turned and watched. Marcus leaned back in his chair with the comfortable, expansive expression of a man who has every reason to expect that what is coming is something in his honor. Diane set down her wine glass and folded her hands in her lap and arranged her face into the warm, slightly tearful expression she wore at moments designed to be memorable. The room was warm and full and still and completely attentive. 83 people waited. Claire brought the microphone to her lips. She thanked everyone for coming. She said it with the unhurried, genuine warmth of someone who actually meant it, and she did. Even with everything she was about to do, she was genuinely grateful that these people had traveled and dressed and rearranged their weekends to be in this room, on what was supposed to have been the most significant day of her life. She said that this day had meant more to her than any of them could possibly know, and every word of that was true. She said she had prepared something she wanted to share before the first dance, something she was calling a tribute. Several people at the nearest tables made the soft, anticipatory sounds of guests expecting to be moved by a romantic gesture. The main display screen behind the head table came to life. Phones went up across the room. The ballroom settled into an attentive, smiling quiet. Claire pressed the clicker in her palm. The first image appeared on the screen. It was not a photograph of Claire and Marcus. It was a calendar, clean, digital, with 12 specific dates highlighted in red. Beside each date, 2 columns. One read, Marcus, reported location. The other read, GPS verified location. The 2 columns did not match on a single one of the 12 dates. The room absorbed this. There was a beat, 2 seconds, perhaps 3, in which no one was entirely certain whether they were looking at what they thought they were looking at. The mind searches, instinctively, for an alternative explanation, when the obvious one is too large to land immediately. And then the second slide appeared. It was a screenshot of a text message exchange. The contacts listed were Marcus and a phone number saved under a name that every person in that room recognized as belonging to the woman in the deep green dress in the front row. The room went completely still. The text messages were not graphic. Claire had selected them with great deliberateness for this reason. She had no interest in spectacle or humiliation for its own sake. She wanted documentation. What the messages showed was a pattern. Frequent, deliberate, ongoing communication, coded in the particular shorthand that develops only between people who have been sharing something they have agreed not to name plainly. References to time spent together. Plans arranged around Claire's schedule. A private language built through sustained contact. One message, sent from Diane to Marcus, read, "She won't know. She never knows." Claire had found this one particularly worth including in what she had assembled. The room read it in silence on a screen 10 feet across. At the head table, Marcus's face had changed entirely from what it had been 60 seconds before. He had both hands flat on the tablecloth in front of him, and he was not moving. The third slide was the restaurant receipt. Mira's Kitchen, March 14th, $94. Beside it, the GPS record, placing Marcus in that zip code on that evening. Beside that, a screenshot of the text he had sent Claire at 7:15 the same night, telling her his client dinner was running long. The fourth slide held a single line of text, and then, on the night before this wedding, it remained on screen for 3 full seconds before advancing to the fifth slide, which showed the hotel floor directory with the 8th floor circled and room 814 marked, and beneath it, "I did not need a confession. I had everything I needed." The sixth slide was an audio waveform. The room speakers carried Diane's voice into every corner of the ballroom. 47 seconds. When it ended, Claire stood at the center of the room in complete silence, and she let that silence last. She had planned for it. She let every person in that room sit inside it for as long as it needed to hold. That silence, the silence Claire Montgomery has described in the time since as the most satisfying sound she has ever heard in her life, was not the silence of shock or of confusion. It was the silence of 83 people who had seen and heard the same thing and were holding the full weight of it simultaneously. Marcus had not moved from his chair.
His face had the particular emptiness of a person from whom the ground has been removed so completely and so suddenly that the body has not yet caught up with instructions about what to do. Diane was looking at the display screen. Her wineglass was in front of her. Her hands were in her lap. Claire looked at the room. She looked at her mother's face for a long, deliberate moment. She said into the microphone, in the same clear and unhurried voice she had used for every word of the evening, "Thank you all for being here. I mean that with everything I have." She placed the microphone on the nearest table. She picked up her bouquet. She had placed the bouquet on the edge of the head table before dinner, precisely where she could reach it from where she was standing when the moment came. She picked it up now. She walked to the main doors of the ballroom. Tessa was already positioned just inside the exit. Overnight bag in one hand, car keys in the other, a light jacket folded over her arm, because April evenings in Charlotte still carry a chill after dark. Claire took the bag. She took the keys. She and Tessa held each other for one moment, firmly, without words. Then Claire pushed open the main doors and walked out into the April night, and the sounds of the ballroom fell away behind her, and she did not look back. She has been deliberate about saying this since. She chose not to look back, not because she was afraid of what she would see, but because there was nothing behind her that she still needed. The story in that room was complete. The one that mattered going forward had already begun. The scene inside the ballroom after she left was something she would come to know only gradually, from different people who had been there, in the days and weeks that followed. There was no single dramatic confrontation, no pursuit, no shouted exchange that resolved anything cleanly. What happened was considerably quieter and considerably more conclusive. People turned to one another with expressions that had not yet decided what to be. Some reached for their phones. Some set them back down. Marcus's mother left the room within 5 minutes of Claire's exit, accompanied by Marcus's father and his younger brother, all three of them moving with the deliberate speed of people who need to not be in a particular place anymore. Other guests gradually did the same, not in a rush, not in any coordinated way, but in the incremental, quiet manner of a gathering that has lost its reason for being and cannot find its way back to one. The room emptied. The DJ did not play a single song. Marcus did not follow Claire out of that ballroom. He did not come after her. He did not send anyone after her. This is the specific detail to which Claire has returned most often in the time since, and not because she wanted him to come after her. She did not, but because the absence of that impulse told her something precise and important about the person she had been engaged to. A man who was genuinely undone by what he had done, who felt the full weight of what his choices had cost the person he had claimed to love, might have run after her, even understanding it would accomplish nothing. The impulse to try is itself meaningful. Marcus sat at the head table. He made several phone calls in the parking lot later that evening. Gerald Whitfield, his business partner, was in his call log twice before midnight. The seed Claire had planted 3 weeks earlier at dinner with Gerald, those careful questions about the South End property and its recent valuations, had taken root. Marcus was already discovering, on the night of his wedding, that the financial landscape he thought he understood was not as uncomplicated as he had believed. The post-nuptial filing that Patricia Morse had drafted was submitted within 6 days of the wedding. Because the marriage had been legally executed, because both parties and the officiant had signed the license. There was a marriage, however briefly, to dissolve, and the dissolution that followed was considerably less favorable to Marcus than it would have been had Claire simply walked away at any point before the ceremony was completed. The South End property, with its documented appreciation and Claire's established co-ownership interest, became subject to a negotiation that Patricia conducted with a precision and a thoroughness that delivered Claire substantially more than Marcus had assumed she would receive. She did not pursue everything she was theoretically entitled to. That was not the aim. The aim was to refuse the version of this story in which she absorbed all of the cost while the people who had made those choices absorbed none of it. She was not left with nothing. She was not the only person in this situation who paid. The marriage lasted 11 days in the legal record. In every practical sense, it had been over the moment Claire's hand had found the handle of a hotel room door on the 8th floor at 11:47 on the night before the wedding. Marcus retained an attorney who came well recommended and ultimately achieved very little. Not because the law failed him, but because the documentation Claire had assembled was organized with a thoroughness
that left almost no room for the kind of narrative repositioning that makes contested proceedings complicated. He had perhaps anticipated a process driven by grief and anger and the reactive emotion that creates openings for negotiation. Claire had already moved through grief and anger, quietly and privately, during the 6 weeks between Tessa's disclosure and the wedding day, and what remained on the other side of that was clarity. The proceedings concluded in 4 months. Nothing about them was contested in any meaningful way. There was simply nothing left to contest. Diane called Claire 17 times on the night of the wedding. Claire knows this precisely because she counted the missed calls the following morning. She did not answer a single one. There were 4 voicemails in the days that followed, none of which Claire listened to in their entirety. The first one she started and stopped within 30 seconds. What she heard in those 30 seconds was her mother's voice arriving in the specific register it had used, over 38 years, to position Claire as the one who owed something, and she recognized the mechanism so immediately and completely that there was nothing to gain by continuing. She pressed stop. She has not spoken to Diane since the night of the rehearsal dinner, when her mother held her face in both hands at the coat check and said she was proud of her. That was the last conversation between them. Claire does not describe the silence that has followed as a source of peace. She describes it as accurate. There is a difference between those two things that matters enormously. Diane's social world contracted over the months that followed the wedding, gradually and without any single organized cause. The mutual friends who had known both Diane and Claire navigated the aftermath, the way people navigate these situations, with discomfort, with divided loyalty, with the slow thinning of invitations and contact that is never formally announced, but is conclusive enough to be felt by the person at the center of it. Diane's phone rang less. The Sunday social group that had included her for years dissolved without any formal ending. Her name appeared with less frequency in the shared digital spaces that had previously included her without question. None of this was the result of a coordinated decision. No one gathered and agreed to withdraw. It happened in the organic way of something that becomes too heavy for the people around it to continue holding alongside their other affections. 6 months after the wedding, Diane sent a letter by post to an address she still had for Claire. Claire received it. She did not open it. She placed it in a folder in a drawer that she has not returned to since. Marcus resumed his professional life within the month following the wedding. He was seen at industry events in Charlotte by the end of May. His firm continued to operate. The settlement had cost him meaningfully, more than he had planned for, more than he had assumed it would, but it had not undone him in any professional sense, and the exterior of his life reconstituted itself with the efficiency of a man who has the resources and the social framework to manage appearances effectively. What Claire heard through Gerald Whitfield, some months later, was that Marcus had become noticeably quieter in those industry settings, less easy in a room. The particular fluency with which he had always moved through social occasions, that quality of making every person he spoke to feel noticed and chosen, seemed to have become something he had to work at, rather than something that came naturally. She did not feel satisfaction at this information. Exactly. She felt recognition. That is what it looks like, she thought, when a person finally has to carry the full weight of something they did. Claire left Charlotte 18 months after the wedding. She accepted a position at a larger architectural firm in Raleigh, the same city where her father had, many years before, maintained a separate family life that she was the last person in her own life to learn about. And she moved on a Saturday morning in October, with 2 friends helping, and a moving truck she had hired herself, and a sense of forward motion that did not feel like escape. It felt, she has said, like choosing. She furnished her new apartment in the deliberate and unhurried way she approached every environment she occupied, selecting pieces that were functional and honest and entirely hers. She adopted a 3-year-old rescue dog named Theodore, who preferred the warmest patch of sunlight in any room and maintained a considered, unhurried distrust of unfamiliar people that Claire understood with great specificity. She began working with a therapist in Raleigh, not because she was in crisis, but because she had decided at 39 that she was done processing everything alone at a kitchen table in the hours before dawn. Here is the thing that Claire has said in the time since that stays with you most. She does not describe what she did at that reception as revenge. She uses the word clarity instead, and the distinction is important. Revenge, as most people encounter it, is about the desire to inflict pain, to make someone feel what you felt. or worse. What Claire built and executed over those 6 weeks was not driven by the desire to cause pain. It was driven by a refusal to accept the version of this story in which she alone discovered a devastating truth and alone absorbed it, and the two people who had arranged it walked away without any consequence visible to anyone who loved her. She was unwilling to be the only person in that room who knew what had happened. She made the room know, and then she left. Those are 3 separate and deliberate things. All 3 of them mattered. All 3 of them were hers. The question Claire gets asked most often, in the time since the story began circulating through the people who were in that ballroom and the people who heard about it from the people who were in that ballroom, is whether she misses her mother. The answer she gives is not what people expect to hear. She says she misses the version of her mother she believes once existed. The woman who worked 2 jobs and came to every school play and taught her to be careful with the things and people she let close. Whether that woman was ever fully real, or whether she was a version of Diane assembled for a daughter who needed her to be a particular thing, she genuinely does not know. She suspects the truth sits somewhere between those 2 possibilities, the way most important truths do. She does not believe Diane hated her. She believes Diane loved her in a way that was not generous enough to survive contact with the thing Diane wanted most for herself. That distinction, Claire has said, is the one that allowed her to stop waiting for the apology that was never coming in any form she could use. She rarely speaks about Marcus. This is not the silence of resentment, and she has been clear about that. It is something closer to genuine indifference, which is a different state entirely, and considerably harder to counterfeit if it is not real. What she has said, on the few occasions she has addressed it at all, is that Marcus chose a path that required him to become a person capable of sustaining a prolonged and deliberate deception of someone he claimed to love, and that people who are capable of sustaining that kind of deception tend to have been capable of it before you arrived in their life. She does not believe she was the victim of a singular failure in an otherwise honest person. She believes she was involved with someone whose moral architecture contained a particular structural weakness that she had not been able to identify clearly at the beginning, and she does not know with certainty that she could have identified it even had she been looking more carefully. She made her choices with the information she had. She responded to what she found with the tools she had spent a lifetime building. Both of those things are true simultaneously. There is a truth in Claire Montgomery's story that reaches beyond the specific people involved and the specific choices they made. It is a truth about what happens to a person when the ground shifts completely beneath them, when the individuals whose presence they have built their sense of safety on reveal themselves capable of something that reorders everything they thought they understood. The expected response to that kind of revelation is collapse, grief, the kind of complete disorientation that takes everything you have just to survive intact. Claire did not collapse. Not because she is a person who does not feel things. She has said plainly and more than once that she felt everything, but because she had spent 38 years learning, through circumstances that gave her no choice in the matter, that the feeling and the functioning do not have to wait for each other. That clarity can share the same moment as heartbreak. That grief does not have to pause the decisions that need to be made. She walked down an aisle knowing everything she knew. She walked out of a ballroom having said everything that needed to be said. She did both of those things with her spine completely straight, and she walked away without looking back. We tell stories like Claire's on this channel not because betrayal is unusual. It is not, and anyone who tells you otherwise has simply not lived long enough or openly enough to know better. We tell them because of what certain people do with the betrayal when it arrives. Not all of those people have Claire's resources, or her attorney, or her particular brand of patient and methodical preparation. Not all of them have the 6 weeks of lead time, or the documentation, or the presence of mind to make a financial move that protects what they have built. But what is available to every single person in a situation like this, regardless of means or circumstance or how far along the thing has already gone, is the refusal. The refusal to be the only witness to your own life. The refusal to absorb a cost that does not belong to you. The refusal to disappear quietly. That is not a product of wealth or strategy or access to the right professionals. It is a decision about the kind of person you are willing to keep being, even when staying that person is the hardest thing currently available to you. Claire Montgomery made that decision. It changed everything, including, she would tell you, herself. So I want to leave you with a question, a real one, not a rhetorical one. If you had found out what Claire found out 6 weeks before your wedding, What would you have done? Would you have called it off immediately that same afternoon, the moment Tessa told you about the car? Would you have confronted your mother and your fiancé directly that night and demanded to know the truth to their faces? Would you have walked away entirely on the night you stood in that hotel doorway, quietly, alone, no audience, no performance, and simply never come back? Or would you have done what Claire did, gathered everything, said nothing, waited for exactly the right moment, and then let the truth surface in a room full of everyone who needed to know it? There is no correct answer to that question. There are only the answers people give when they are being fully honest about who they are and what they are truly capable of in the hardest moments. Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and I mean that. Before we go, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Next week on Tales of Whisper, we are going to tell you the story of a woman who opened her home to her closest friend in the aftermath of that friend's devastating divorce. She thought she was being the kind of person most people only wish they had in their corner. She thought she was offering a lifeline. 6 months later, she found something hidden in a corner of her own home, in a place that no houseguest should ever have been, that changed everything she believed about the word loyalty and the word friend. It is a story about generosity and what it costs, about what happens when the door you leave open is not the one you intended. You will not want to miss it. Subscribe now. New stories on Tales of Whisper every single week, and they only go deeper from here.